Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Fry Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Peter Stevens. Based in Zurich, Peter is an executive coach, author, and certified Scrum trainer. He's best known as the creator of the personal agility system, the simple, scalable approach to effective leadership. Collaborating with Joe Justice, he documented and defined the principles of extreme manufacturing, the technical foundation of Scrum for hardware. You can follow him on Twitter at Peter Stev, and that's STEV, and check out his website and blog at saat-network.ch, and you can watch his Agile Minute and other videos on his YouTube channel. Peter is the author of the book, The Illustrated Guide to Scrum, Scrum Explained Through Infographics. In the book, Peter answers two questions with clear and easy to understand infographics. How does Scrum work, and how do you do Scrum effectively? In this interview, we're going to talk about Peter's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience creating a book. So thank you very much, Peter, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Well, thank you, Len. I'm really excited to be here. And if I could just add one thing, first of all, really amazing job on the bio. That's one of the best, 30-second versions I've ever heard. I'm much more active on LinkedIn than I am on Twitter. So if someone's wants to follow me, I would suggest follow me on LinkedIn rather than Twitter.
Got it. Okay. It makes sense. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found yourself into the sort of career journey that you've traveled for yourself.
Okay. Well, I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. My father worked for the government as what they call civil service employees, something that impacted me in ways I had no idea would impact me until 30 or 40 years later. I went to school in Central New York and got interested in programming languages. And when I was looking for my first job, there was this little company in Seattle called Microsoft, and they had gotten big by doing Microsoft Basic and Microsoft Fortran and Microsoft COBOL, and I thought a company doing programming languages would be a place for me. And so I actually realized after the fact, I turned down a job at Xerox PARC to go there. That was kind of one of those fateful decisions. And but anyway, so I was there for 3 years. The other thing which really influenced me growing up is my mother always loved French, and somehow I inherited that. It's kind of a long story, but I ended up being an exchange student to France when I was in high school. And I came back really stumbling over my English. I mean, I did full immersion living with a French family. And after a couple of years at Microsoft, I thought it was time for a sabbatical, and I wanted to go to Europe. And actually, I wanted to go to France, but I couldn't find anyone who wanted to go to France with me. But one of my best friends in Seattle wanted to go to Germany. So our compromise was to tour around France and then spend 2 months learning German. And that led me to getting settled in Switzerland. Again, another long story, but we'll get straight to the point. I went to work for one of the first startups in Switzerland, or startups in the modern sense, a company now known as Oanda.
Oanda?
Oanda.com, or Oanda for short.
Yeah, I used to use Oanda all the time for foreign exchange stuff.
Yeah, well, we developed the first system to grab the currency data off of the Reuters screen. Back then, we were doing screen scraping. There was no such thing as an API. This proprietary protocol for Reuters. It was kind of fun stuff. And but the real meat of their business was actually research into trading markets and kind of doing fractals and all the nuclear physics research. Kind of very, very high level math being applied to understanding the movements of the markets. And you can actually go Google for their contributions to understanding market models. Anyway, so that was the beginning of my career in Switzerland. A couple of years later, if my first job was working for one of the first Swiss startups, the one that impacted me the most was working for a very traditional Swiss manufacturing company, literally the Swiss Industrial Corporation. They made, their original business was the rolling stock for trains. They made packaging machines. They made weapons, which I think were sold to the FBI, among others. And I got called in to redesign their, the network architecture as they moved from mini computers to Sun workstations. And this was 1993, and I call that now my first Scrum project, my first Agile project. You say, wait a minute, Scrum didn't exist in 1993, and it didn't. But I stumbled on the same patterns, and much later when I discovered Scrum, that was the other big aha moment for me. That was about 12 years later, and I said, wow, finally a way of organizing people that makes sense. and I never really looked back. And I've been in the agile space ever since. Despite all of the polemic discussions going on LinkedIn these days, agility is where it's at. If you want a responsive organization, if you want to solve complex problems, writing software, developing products is a hugely complex problem. I actually think that running a corporation or even a company, start at 30 people, is a very complex problem. You've got, all you've got are symptoms. You don't really know what the causes are. You don't really know if you've gotten the right answer. In fact, you're not even sure if you're asking the right questions. But you do know that if you get it wrong, bad things are going to happen. So, as I say, complexity is kind of, the topic of the day. And so all of my work has really been about helping people manage complexity. And the secret sauce to that is actually helping them work together with each other effectively, taking away the friction between collaboration.
Yeah, that's a really great description. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, and we'll get to sort of things like extreme manufacturing and your interest in that and stuff like that. I'm very curious to talk to you about, like what you call Musk companies like Tesla and SpaceX and stuff like that. But before we do that, so a lot of Leanpub authors have a background in computer science and stuff like that, and so interestingly, like the podcast has become a kind of time capsule of people's experience of their slice of time studying computer science. And I'm just very curious to hear, so like dating you, late 70s, early 80s, that was when you got your computer science degree before Microsoft, before Windows. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about it, if you recall, what was studying computer science like back in those days?
Okay, so I went to a so-called liberal arts college. And so studying computer science was very abstract. I mean, the introduction to computer science for comp sci majors is we had a DEC System 10 as our kind of main computer that the students used. We actually transitioned to personal microcomputers while I was there. But the language we learned, we did not learn assembly language. No, that was too primitive and too mundane. The chairman of the department had created an abstract computer programming language, which was actually, conceptually identical to the programming language of the DEC System 10, the machine language of the DEC System 10. But we weren't allowed to write actual machine language code. We had to use the abstract version. Okay. So that was I mean, at the time we thought that was a bit weird, but the guy was also on his way to retirement. Oh. What was more interesting is the main teaching language, at least when I was there, was a language called Simula 67, which was if we have kind of the original structured programming language was ALGOL. Simula 67 was created in I think it was Norway or Sweden, probably both, as a simulation language. And it's the first, what we would call object-oriented programming language. Okay, that is, you had classes and you had methods and you created instances and all that sort of fun stuff. And so it was really interesting to watch as, C++ and C# and of course Smalltalk, as they came to, explode on the computing scene. And so, on the one hand, we were very abstract, but the cutting edge is also abstract. And so that was kind of, as I say, for me, I kind of yearned for the days when I was programming in Simula 67 because it was in some ways the most elegant language I've ever worked with. Certainly much more elegant than BASIC or 8086 assembly language, which is what I went to work at, or actually, no, correction, 8080 assembly language, which is what I was working on at Microsoft.
That leads me to ask a question that's come up a few times in the past on the podcast, which is, if you were starting out now, like let's say you were just graduated from high school and you wanted a career in kind of tech, would you get a full 4-year American computer science degree, do you think?
Well, see, so my kids grew up in Switzerland and my daughter really wanted to study in the USA. Okay, now she's not doing computer science, she's doing music, completely different. She looked at the prices of going to a 4-year institution in the US, and they were so outrageous, she didn't even ask if we could do it. Okay, so, geez, would I do a 4-year institution in the US right now with kind of the price structure that they have? Well, if I were part of the 1%, I surely yes. If I were anyplace else, I'd really think hard about it because the situation is, I don't know. I think, I think the education system in the U.S. is really severely challenged right now. Having said that, I would definitely encourage someone to study. And my son actually started out. He looked at how much stress the Swiss school system puts aspiring college students through in high school, and he looked at that and he said, "Nah, I don't want to do that." And so he did an apprenticeship with a complementary education. They call it the I'm trying to remember how we can translate this into English, but basically it's a professional intermediate degree, I think is the translation of it. And so, you get math and physics and some German, but not enough to get you into university. But it does qualify you to go to a technical college afterwards. And that's what he was thinking he was going to do. And then as he grew up and matured and particularly his curiosity for the world developed, he realized, I probably could do this university thing. And then he kind of realized that, well, if I went to the technical university, I'd have a good career. But if I went to the university, that is the ETH or the EPFL in Switzerland, I'd be getting into really cutting edge research and I can do things that are going to have an impact. And so he put his nose to the grindstone. He's just finishing the catch-up year.
Okay.
And, so there's still the small formality of passing the test, but he's done quite well. And he also went at it with kind of discipline and organization, which 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds usually don't have that much of. And that's what the school system really demands of them. So now he did it and it's a breeze. At first, I was very skeptical of this system. But what I really appreciate about it is he came out of the system without any significant debt. In fact, he had money in the bank. Because when you do an apprenticeship, you actually go to work for a company. Now, we could have some conversations about whether they pay, how much do they pay and do they pay enough and do they get a good education? And that really depends on the company. Well, to some extent on the field that you're in and to a great extent on the company you're at. But I find he came out very well prepared and without any debt. And now he's curious about things like machine learning and there's a couple of other things that are on his radar screen and he's ready to dive in.
That's a really great answer. I love hearing you gave us your own approach to it and your experience, and then your daughters and your sons as well, and on different continents and things like that, which is so, and over a course of time and stuff like that. I mean, I'm definitely I've got a lot of different answers to that question over time, but I'm definitely on the side of if you have the opportunity, the means and the opportunity in your youth to spend a few years and study, take it. It'll change your whole life in ways you can't anticipate. That's why those years are so important to do when you're young. And that's the nature of education, right? Like real education is you can't know what it's going to be until you've learned it, which is why it's a big leap of faith and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, particularly with people looking for careers in tech and stuff like that, and if you're in a place where it is really expensive, if you want to be a programmer, you don't necessarily need to get a computer science degree. You really can dive in. And like what everybody says is look, it can get you foot in the door. There might be organizations like particularly governmental or defense organizations, for example, that have requirements for university degrees and things like that. But 20 years later, how good you are as a programmer or how well you understand it, in the end, it's up to how hard you work and how hard you try to understand it, no matter what your path is.
Well, kind of maybe my big aha moment. So when I was at university, my favorite topic was data structures. We learned about stacks and we learned about queues and we learned about trees and did programming on it. And it was real fun programming these things in Simula. I wish we had known about TDD back then, test-driven development. It would have made life a lot easier. So now let's fast forward. So I'm now about 30. I am visiting my I'm visiting. So I met a young lady in from the Italian part of Switzerland, and her relatives were from Italy. And so at some point we're visiting her cousins, and her cousin is about the same age that I was when I was taking data structures, and he's studying computer science. And I said, "What topic are you doing?" And he said, "Data structures." And I said, "Oh, cool. Can I look at your book? Can I see what you're doing?" Now, my book, when I learned it was, I don't know, I probably still have the book somewhere, but it was roughly A5 format, so about half of an 8.5 by 11 page, and probably around 250 pages or something like that. His book was A4, so full 8.5 by 11, probably twice as many pages. And I was scrolling through the citations, and as a rough guess, just looking at it, calibrated to my thumb, I would say 2/3 of the papers that were cited in that book had not yet been written when I graduated from college. And that was after 7 years, maybe 8. And so I was like, oh, it's just insane. And this was, and we say this was back in 1990, and we say, oh, things are so much faster now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But, so the world is moving on. And actually, that was kind of why I decided to get out of being a developer or an architect or, really in the tech side, because I just felt that unless you're in a university context, you're really doing something cutting edge, the world is going to pass you by. Now, the human problems, on the other hand, those are eternal. And I discovered that with when I first discovered Scrum, and then later as I moved into personal agility and looking at it as a leadership. As long as we care about getting people working together, we're going to care about these human issues, because it's the friction and the roadblocks that we put in the way that slow us down. And getting the information to flow, getting the people to want to cooperate with each other. That's kind of really what it's all about.
You give me the best gift a podcast guest can give a podcast host, which is a great segue. So I wanted to ask you about the personal agility system. And that's so interesting that you brought it up in the context of because that's about yourself, but it's also about other people. And you just reminded me of, we had Jeff Sutherland on the podcast a while ago. And he has a few origin stories for Scrum. But one of them is people would rather die than change, as he put it sort of remarkably. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the personal agility system is and how it can help people themselves change and adapt to situations.
Okay, well, let's start with this topic about change. And one of the things I discovered very early in my Scrum career is that change is easy if you want to do it.
Right.
We make this was I first read this in the book Switch from Chip and Dan Heath, and or Chip Heath and Dan Heath. So that I don't want to imply that they're a couple. I think they're brothers. They excuse me. We make decisions to change all the time. In my particular case, I made a decision to go to a particular university. I could have gone to another one, but I went to that one. I made a decision to take this job, but not that job. I made a decision to get married. Much, much later, I made a decision to get divorced, and then I made a decision to get married again. And then I made a decision to have kids. And if you don't realize that your life is not under control, just wait till you have kids, because then you realize you've started a game, you have no idea how it's going to end, and you've got no choice but to keep playing, pretty much. So, these kinds of changes, we make them all the time, and they're not a big deal. The problem comes when someone says, you there, change. Move the leaders to the left, okay? Nobody wants to be changed, okay? So, one of the secrets to any kind of transformation program in an organization is people need to want to do it. First of all, it's got to make sense. It's got to make sense to them. And they need to at least buy into the process. They need to at least say, yeah, I'm on board with this, as opposed to saying, that I am, oh, yes, well, we're going to do this because it's going to be good for somebody's bonus upstairs. And once you get people on board, then it's easy to do. In fact, when we're talking about transforming organizations, what I discovered is if you get the staff on board and they say, yes, can we do this? There's nothing that's scarier to management than energy unleashed in their staff, because they're saying, oh my God, how are we going to keep this under control? And so it's kind of a fine line between unleashing the energy and not scaring the management that, they're not going to be able to control this. And this is really the, part of how the role of leadership changes. It goes from channeling energy to keeping everybody under control. So coming back to personal agility, to answer your question, I discovered Scrum in 1993, where I discovered the patterns of Scrum. And then I read, I guess it was Ken Schraber's second book about agile project management with Scrum. And, there was this line in there, which was, remember your best project. And I thought back to that project in 1993, and he said, "Didn't it look a lot like Scrum?" And I thought, "Yeah, it looked exactly like Scrum." And from the and the best part about Scrum is the developers do the estimating, not the Scrum Master or the product owner. And that had always been, the bane of my existence, trying to do estimates that I then had to uphold. And when I heard that, I was sold. So once this was 2006, and after learning about Scrum, I really never looked back. And
just before we go on, we should probably take maybe a minute or two for anyone listening who's never heard of Scrum, or who's heard of it in the sort of context of many other things. What is it?
Okay. The way I describe it, I say Scrum is a simple team-based framework for solving complex problems. Okay, you have a problem. You say, okay, what skills and know-how do we need to solve that problem? You get all the guys and gals together who are needed to solve the problem, and then you work to a solution. And the only constraint is at least once a month, you have to have a tangible result that you can look at and inspect, to see, are we on track? Are we building something that we need, that we want, that the market wants, kind of whatever your acceptance is, at least once a month, you have to have something tangible that you can check. Okay. And this is why I found, for instance, the development program at SpaceX so interesting, because it all happened in public, and they went from the first water tank to the cryogenic water tank to the water tower to the flying rocket water tower to the suborbital test bed. And you see them going from prototype to prototype in iterations of about a month. Okay. Now I'm not saying they're doing Scrum, but they are producing that prototype that they can test in real life once a month. Okay. And that's a hugely powerful pattern when you want to solve a complex problem. Get a release candidate of your solution once a month, and sooner or later you're going to have something that flies.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and that's something I think I mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask you about your interest in Musk companies. And there's all kinds of other things going on around any kind of bigger than life kind of figure. He's one of them, but
yeah,
I think a lot of people lose perspective sometimes on just focus on these companies and what they've managed to achieve, and what you're interested in, I think in particular, is how they've managed to achieve it. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the secret sauce is, because Tesla's worth what is it, 8 times? Well, I mean, it goes up and down, but it's worth 8 times Ford.
If you exclude Toyota, and this is before this is when it hit the bottom,
right?
At $150 a share. It was worth if you exclude Toyota, it was worth as much as the rest of the auto industry combined. And probably with the latest rises, it's now approaching the value of the entire automobile industry combined. And you say, why is this? Okay. And what I think is really interesting about all the Musk companies, it's definitely true of Tesla and SpaceX. It's true of Neuralink. I haven't quite figured out if it's true for Twitter or not, but I suspect it is. We just don't understand it yet. But on the other hand, this is 42, but never mind. So anyway, the Musk companies start out with a 1,000-year vision for humanity. We want humanity to be there 1,000 years from now or 1,000,000 years from now. We've only been around for a couple thousand years as a civilization with culture. And if we want that civilization to be here, there are so many ways that civilization could end. Most of them are self-inflicted at this point. Not all of them, okay? And so, each one of them, so we start with this, we want humanity to be here. What are the critical problems that need to be solved? Okay, now one of them is we need to live on sustainable energy. We cannot go on polluting the atmosphere and, filling the oceans with plastics, et cetera. So, the long-term vision for Tesla is to catalyze a change to sustainable energy. Okay? They do that by building electric cars. They do that by building solar panels and deploying solar panels. They do that by deploying battery tech, et cetera, et cetera. But their main mission is to catalyze the change. And so basically, when you're buying Tesla, you're buying a vision for the future. Okay, you're saying we are helping humanity get to a better place. The same is true of SpaceX. SpaceX is not simply about building rocket ships. It's about making humanity multiplanetary. And this brings us to the concept of the limiting KPI. What is making it difficult for us to be multiplanetary? And it's all about getting 1 kilogram of cargo into orbit. And so basically everything that SpaceX has done since their founding has been about lowering the cost of getting to orbit. And, first with the Falcon 9, making the Falcon 9 reusable, now with the Starship, they're basically focused on bringing the cost down by, orders of magnitude. Okay. And so it's this long-term vision, and a really relentless focus on innovation to make that vision possible. Okay. Right now, when they started out with electric cars, the batteries weren't really there. And when they created their first prototype, I think we're still at the barely good enough phase. Okay. They're not as seriously insufficient as they were 10 years ago, but they're still just barely good enough. We'd like to have another 300 or 400 kilometers of range on our cars so we don't have to worry about it so much. And we like them to charge them half the time. But, they've started an innovation process. And this is the other thing. They're really focused on relentlessly innovating. Okay. So this is, already here, name me 3 other companies with a similar long-term vision and a similar focus on innovation.
Yeah, and in addition to that, their innovation. I mean, I think when we think of innovation, we typically think about like, a faster car, one that can go. They innovate on process, as well, right? Like, so I think you call it in one of your videos the algorithm or something like that, right? Like where you're constantly iterating on your, not just on like your product design or something.
Right.
I put it, but you're iterating on how you approach things and how you do things, and this is I really liked your description of that algorithm, which has like 5 steps or something like that, which people can watch on your YouTube channel. It's really good and very clear. But the idea that like, I mean, what I like to say is like, what Elon Musk saw was that people weren't actually trying to achieve goals in these industries, both the automotive and the space industries. They were caught up in bureaucratic stuff and weird cultural things like the American car industry was caught up in. Weird. The only cycle that mattered was like new features for the next year's model. No one was actually trying to build, like, let's take Tesla, the best car they could. Literally no one was trying to do that. And when you realize that, and no one's trying to do it in the best way that they can either. And so when you get to that level of thinking where it's like, we're actually like you're saying, goal driven, we're actually trying to achieve something, not quarterly profits. And we're also going to be thinking about how we do it in order to get there. Then you have this sort of possibility for real transformative kind of action.
Yeah. And I think that's what Musk himself has realized, that he's figured out how to make innovation a repeatable process. Okay. And that's kind of what Scrum was trying to do. And it's a partial solution to the problem. It's not a complete solution. And I think if you take Scrum and kind of add the Musk mentality, most companies will just, it'll be like that jump into hyperspace from Star Wars. This is, as they start, all of a sudden developing and innovating much, much faster than they could before. The only company I know I can think of that's come even close to having the impact of a Musk company was Xerox, back in the days of Xerox PARC. I just saw a video about this from Alan Kay, who was one of the lead researchers. Remember I mentioned Simula 67 to Smalltalk? Well, among other things, Xerox PARC invented Smalltalk. They also invented the modern PC with the Windows icon mouse interface, the modern word processor. They also invented the Ethernet, and they invented about half of the internet. Okay. And all of that was the result of 25 researchers. They rented some space from Stanford University. They put their office building there. They hired 25 researchers and asked them the question, what is the office of the future going to look like 25 years from now? Okay. Which is way beyond the time horizon of, kind of most companies. And they said, okay, let's, if this is where we're going to be, what technologies do we need to start making happen? Okay. And they started innovating on, experimenting with what could they do with the computer. And they came up with the mouse and the Windows interface. How are we going to get the computers to talk to each other? Back in the day, the phone network was very hierarchical. You had a wire, and that was associated with a phone number, and that phone number was associated with a local switch. And the only way to route the calls was through the hierarchy. That's how you found the phone. Okay, it worked, but it was hugely inflexible. And they said, well, we could actually put them all on one cable and just give them an address, and then they listen for messages directed to them. And then the computers respond. And all of a sudden, we don't need all of these cables. Okay. Now, in the meantime, we've actually gone back to kind of star form cables. But notice how, it used to be your telephone number was tied to a particular telephone line. And now you can take your telephone and go anywhere in the world, and it pretty much works. And that was pioneered at Xerox. Okay. The interesting thing about Xerox is their leadership was not really prepared for what they generated. And of all the ideas that they produced, I think the only one they really made money on was the laser printer. The whole Windows icon mouse word processor that got borrowed by Microsoft and Apple. And, once they let the cat out of the bag, it was out of their control. But just the laser printer was hundreds of times the return on investment.
For anyone, just for anyone watching or listening who is unfamiliar with the history of this organization, check out something called The Mother of All Demos by Douglas Engelbart. It will blow your mind when it was actually when this video was made, and it was all done live. It's like real time on screen collaboration and stuff like that, which was like it was a bit contrived, but like it was still the important thing was the ideas that were there. And it's really amazing. Just moving on. So anyone who's interested in maybe sort of getting to that hyperspeed kind of thing, your book is The Illustrated Guide to Scrum Explained Through Infographics. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about who the book is for.
Okay. Well, I think the book is going to be useful for anybody who is trying to explain Scrum to other people. Okay. Because the problem is, if we go out into the real world, we discover that most Scrum is not done very well. For the simple reason that people don't really understand it. We say, read the guide. Well, that's great, but, getting people to sit down and read 17 pages in the days of social media is kind of difficult. And so where the guide came from is, I'm a Scrum trainer, so what I do is I share with people and with teams how Scrum works. And over the course of the years, I've developed my standard pictures, which I use to explain how it works. And then I thought, I could make these pictures available in a nice, attractive form. And remember, they say you can learn to do anything on YouTube for free. Well, I thought, gee, what if I learned a little bit about design? Okay, could I, if I learned a little bit about design, what would happen? So I spent a day researching YouTube videos and watching YouTube videos on design. And that taught me, for instance, about colors and layouts and the need for white space and things like that. It didn't teach me how to draw. I think that one's kind of hopeless, but I was able now to sit down with the presentation tool or the graphic tool of my choice and make an attractive diagram. And so I set out to basically making visual versions of the pictures that I drew in class. And that kind of took on a life of its own. And one of the first ones I did was a thing called the levels of done. So 10 levels of the definition of done, starting from it works on my machine, and ending with, optimize to maximize, return on investment, usability, et cetera. And I put that one out on LinkedIn. It's the most popular post I've ever done. It probably got, I actually published it about 3 or 4 times, and the most popular version got 1,500 likes. Probably altogether, it's around 2,000 likes. So it's probably around 200,000 views. Which is nothing by the standards of a YouTube star, but for a normal guy in Zurich, it's quite popular. And so anyway, I kind of started creating more and more of these graphics. And so the idea is you're the Scrum Master or even the product owner. You're trying to explain to your colleagues how this stuff works. Getting them to read is difficult. Having a piece of paper that you can put out in front of them and say, well, we start here and then we go to there. And now let's talk about the difference between roles and accountabilities. Okay. And so this is the kind of thing that I wanted to make visual and easy to understand. And for a while I was doing it as an appendix to my course book. And then somehow I realized that, hey, this is too big. And so I said, well, let's make it its own book. And more or less independently, someone reminded me how easy it was to publish things on Leanpub. And I said, well, let's give it a try. And I don't know, an hour later, I had the first version of my book, up on Leanpub and available for sale.
Yeah, it's really great. Thanks for that very great description. I mean, it's just a pleasure to look at and on its own and go through. And I really like the way that it sort of takes advantage of the medium of doing things graphic design wise rather than sort of just text, right? So for example, I mean, I really like the levels are done explained one, which I'm looking at right now, which is very good.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of like funny, like works on my machine. Like anyone who's ever been a developer knows, yeah, that's not done. But the one that really struck me, and I'd come across, I think you talking about this one of your Agile Minute videos, but the types of product owner.
Yeah.
Visualizing that and actually presenting it in a hierarchy that you kind of do from bottom left to top right is very interesting. And I mean, I don't have the experience that you have, but I can get the sense of very battle hardened experience behind that. And it draws us back to what you mentioned earlier about like the big challenge is almost always people. And so just for this part of the interview, I wanted to focus on that one particular page, I guess, and ask you so that I'll just name the 5 different types. I won't be testing you on this, but they're scribe, proxy, representative, sponsor, and entrepreneur. And I wanted to ask you about the scribe in particular. The little thing under scribe says no change if your product owner is a scribe, no change to the status quo, just present for the events. So what kind of person would one encounter? How would you tell a person is a scribe if you're in some meeting with them or something like that?
So if we look at Scrum, we've got this process. Well, there are 2 events where we kind of bring stakeholders together with the developers to talk about the product. Okay. One is called backlog refinement. And so the backlog is kind of our list of requirements and, kind of what do we want to build? And in particular, what's going to come to the top? What do we want to build next? And we need to get the requirements. They need to be small chunks so we can get them done in anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of weeks. And they need to be well understood, et cetera, et cetera. So who is presenting the requirements? And what is the role of the person presenting the requirements? And in particular, who has final say in the decision-making process? Okay. Now, if we look at a large organization, and this is one of the big problems that Scrum was trying to solve, that decision-making process about what is really the requirement is very diffuse. There are a lot of people who have something to say about it. Okay. We have the line management for the development group. We have product management. We have program management. We have portfolio management. We have some technical gurus and whatever, and all of them have something to say about what the product is, but no one really has a clear authority to make a decision. Okay. So the idea of the product owner is to solve the alignment problem. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of noise outside. Scrum doesn't really tell you how to deal with that problem. They just say, we have one person, that's the product owner, they deal with it. Okay. So that's a theory. Now, what happens in the real world? Okay. And you'll notice at the bottom of that page, there's a credit. I won't mention the company. In fact, I'm probably not allowed to mention the company involved, but it was actually presented as a case study at the Agile User Group here in Zurich, where they said, okay, this was our voyage. And the first thing they noticed is that they said, well, okay, yeah, management has said we're going to do Scrum, so we'll we'll do Scrum. We will do Scrum. But they didn't really change anything. So they have somebody calling themselves product owner, but they don't really have anything to do because they're not the decision maker. They're not the subject matter expert. They're not they're just kind of there. And, the most they can do is kind of write down what happened, but they don't have any say in the process.
Right.
That was actually seen as kind of a career development or maybe an organizational development, how their product owners changed, okay, over time. Okay. And so for me, it's interesting, we talk about, increased levels of authority of the product owner. And what I see most often is the, I think I called it proxy. That is, they're the order taker from the stakeholders. They deliver the order to the developers, but they don't actually have much say about, what the priorities are. And so, another problem that Scrum was trying to solve was, people are, they don't get to finish their work. The stakeholders, wherever they are, wherever the people in authority are, they change their mind about what they want before we got the last thing done. And so what that means is you're you're spinning your wheels, you're consuming a lot of money, you're generating a lot of heat, but you're basically producing stuff for the garbage can. Okay. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of show, well, the minimum viable product owner is a representative who can speak for the business. Okay.
Yeah, I know. And it's
an ambassador.
Just to give people a sense of how this works, this is working. So it's going scribe, proxy, representative. So representative is right in the middle, which is kind of brilliant of these 5 types of product owner. And it's basically increasing in terms of like effectiveness. And you talk about the consequences to be expected. And so you define the proxy as an interface role who lacks authority, which is very succinctly put. And you say, expect these consequences, cannot prevent frequent changes, which is something that, I think that can be kind of like it can take a lot. One can work in many organizations and work on many products before understanding that like preventing frequent changes can actually be a very powerful thing and a very important thing, because if changes are happening to requirements are happening too frequently, it can feel like the changes are like progress, but it's the change, the environment of constant change itself can actually depress innovation and productivity.
Yeah. Well, if you never get anything done, you've got nothing of value.
Right.
That's the problem. Okay. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge for organizations, because organizations are not really designed to focus. Okay, that's what's so special about the Musk companies. Musk has huge focus, and his companies are focused. You look at SpaceX; they've got 4, maybe 5 products. Okay, and all of them are related about that that mission of getting humanity to Mars and make humanity multiplanetary. We've got these stakeholders and that stakeholders and these wishes and those wishes, and they're all kind of arm wrestling with each other, for whose wishes are going to be implemented. And, whoever shouted the loudest this week is what the developers are working on, and so the problem is, it's like, are we all pulling in the same direction, or are we pulling in opposite directions? And in fact, I just had a team draw the picture of alignment in their organization, and they drew 5 people, one was pulling this way, one was pulling that way, one was pulling that way, and 2 were pulling down.
Right. Yeah.
And this is the problem that we're trying to solve. And once we get everybody pulling in the same direction, it's just stunning how fast you can go. And that's kind of the message here.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. And it's interesting too, like in terms of like, if you want to have a team aligned, having a shared language, for example, which is one of the reasons I like these typologies, like types of product owner and stuff like that. If you're looking to sort of have your team in alignment, having a book like yours that people can look at, and we've just spent sort of 10 or 15 minutes talking about one page. And it's interesting that's one of the things I really like when I said that you take advantage of the kind of power of the kind of graphic kind of display of things in the book that can really sort of convey a lot of information and bears a lot of attention, but it doesn't feel like onerous reading or something like that. Although of course at Leanpub we love words and reading, but still it's great to see books like this. In the last part of the interview, we always like to talk about the author's process. And so you've talked a little bit about it already. Very interesting that you sort of like to set yourself a day to learn something about design from YouTube. But very specifically, would you mind sharing what tools you use to produce your book?
This is going to be embarrassing, I think. This is PowerPoint.
Okay.
This is PowerPoint, and I generate a PDF file, and I upload the PDF file, and I'm kind of saying, how am I going to get this onto Amazon? Because I don't know of a path from PowerPoint to an Amazon book, but one step at a time. So my approach here is I'm kind of an early riser, and I realized I could either spend my mornings scrolling through Reddit, or I could do something useful. And, because the rest of the family wakes up 2 hours later than I do. So what I do is I get up in the morning and I make a graphic. And often I post it on LinkedIn. And, and actually posting it on LinkedIn is really good because that's super fast feedback, usually, especially if the graphic is interesting, then, or, brings up an interesting topic. Like, the one on Done brought up a lot of discussion. The one on the roles of Scrum, they also brought up a lot of discussion. So, these things, they kind of provoke. And that's why I like graphics as a way of communication, is because they're relatively easy to digest and they let you think it through. So anyway, so this book was mostly PowerPoint. My previous book, the Personal Agility book, that was a combination of Google Docs and Microsoft Word. And in fact, and also the 10 Agile Contracts, that was purely Microsoft Word. That one I did by myself. Personal Agility I did with Maria Mattarelli. And so what we did is we actually did what we call pair writing. So we would get together on Zoom, much like we are now. We'd open up the chapter in Google Docs, and we literally wrote it together.
So interesting.
Every paragraph was co-written by both of us. Yeah.
In a meeting. Oh, that's fascinating.
In a meeting. Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things we discovered is neither one of us was very good at saying, "Oh, I'll write this chapter by Friday," and then actually have something by Friday.
Right. Yeah.
But
yeah.
got an appointment in our calendar.
Mm-hmm.
Then it would happen.
Yeah, that's really great. Using those sort of like talking about processes again, like sort of forcing functions, things like that. I really like. It's a classic thing of the sort of Nobel Prize winning novelists. What's the big difference between them and other people? They get up early when no one's, or they stay up really late when no one else is around. And that's a really great, just a very practical advice. Like set up, if you can find time in your day when other people aren't around, to do things, and set yourself a thing like, I'm going to write one page, or I'm going to make one graphic or something like that. A year later, you've done a lot. If you can just set aside that time, and of course you've had the experience of getting rewarded for it as well, with getting likes and attention and feedback and stuff like that, which you can't get if you don't do anything. And I'm talking to myself here partly too, right? You gotta, or perhaps my past self. You've got to do things, and just setting aside time, having a purpose for that time is sort of very, very useful way of getting things done. When it comes to PowerPoint, I can't tell you how many very good Leanpub covers have been made in PowerPoint, or even Keynote. And when it comes to the path, this is very interesting for me now as a technical kind of challenge. The path from a book like yours in PowerPoint to getting it up on Amazon KDP or something like that, I don't know, but I do know that ChatGPT knows PowerPoint very well. I've used it to get to create basically weekly quizzes. It's something I do with some friends across the country. We do a kind of pub quiz night, trivia night on Zoom, and I've used ChatGPT to produce VBA in PowerPoint that sort of creates a PowerPoint presentation with all 50 questions, each on their own slide, stuff like that. So it's possible that there actually is something you might be able to do using ChatGPT or GPT-4o and PowerPoint, because it really knows PowerPoint very well. So it's possible there's something along those lines, just in the
No, thanks to ChatGPT and a couple of other AIs, I have done them. These things are accelerators of your basic skills, and they're extenders of your skills into new domains. I've written songs. You would not have called me a songwriter a year ago. I've actually gotten those songs done. They've been performed by quote unquote artists.
Oh wow!
Okay, AI generated voices. Okay, and I did my song. I did it as a what is it? Electric blues. I did it as a. I actually had it done as an aria soprano for my daughter.
Cool.
Who informed me rather coolly that she is an alto, not a soprano. So I failed miserably at creating a version composed for her. But anyway,
yeah.
No, I totally the idea with ChatGPT is a good idea. One of the things I think about the Musk companies, they're also very heavy into AI, and if we look at kind of what's trickling out of them, they use both their own AIs and they use general AIs. They do things like using AIs to understand how their engines are working and use them to optimize the design of their engines. And I think there's this quote floating around: you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to someone using AI. And, I don't think there's going to be an AI company that is a company that's just AIs that's going to drive us all out of business. Certainly not anytime in the near future. Now, near future means in the next 2 years in the AI world, but never mind. But I can easily see, if a couple of companies start to understand how to innovate the way the Musk companies do and start to accelerate themselves using the way the Musk companies do, including using AI, I think we're going to see companies just kind of blowing past their competition once they figure it out. But making that happen is really challenging because it means letting go of a lot of the ways we used to do things. And my guess is that will be some university students starting a company rather than an existing company. I could be wrong on that. IBM has been around forever, despite being, its death being reported many times. So, we'll see.
The last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest has published a book on Leanpub, is if there was one magical feature we could build for you, anything that you want, or, and you have to pick between the two, or there was one thing that you really hate about Leanpub that has you shaking your fist every time you log on that we could fix for you. Can you think of anything that you would ask us to do? You can do both, of course, if you want.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of new to Leanpub, so I'm not. So my answer might be a bit naive. What I'm a little challenged by is kind of how do I build that relationship with the community? How do I start a conversation to really get things going back and forth? That I can say, hey guys, I'd like to discuss something with you, not just I'd like to announce a release. So maybe that feature is already there and I don't know about it, but I would be looking for kind of creating more conversation and community in Leanpub.
That's a really great answer. We do have something that we tried a long time ago called forums. So you can create a forum for your book. There might be a bug with forum creation right now. And those are based on what's the name of I think it's Discourse, the platform. But it didn't really take off. People just didn't really use it a lot. So the question you're asking is a very good one, and one that we don't have an answer to yet, which is how do you create community around a book? There's incredible demand for it, right? Like I think Amazon paid a huge amount for a site called Goodreads that they've just, from the last time I saw people in the world complaining about it, they were complaining about how it's just been kind of abandoned and stuff like that. But there's huge demand out there from authors and from readers for something, but no one's nailed it yet. And the main thing that we encourage is sharing your email address in your introduction to your book or something like that, and corresponding with people individually if you have the time, or if you can set aside time for that, because public community stuff is really great, but a lot of the best interactions for people on both ends can actually happen just between the two of them. And I think this might be one of the reasons that no one's found the solution for even the people who really want it. No one's really found the solution because, if you read a book that you really like, or you really learned something from, or you have a deep question about, a public forum might actually not, any public forum, might not be the right place for that. And so anyway, the main place we suggest people start is share your email address, invite individual interactions. And, speaking of it sort of materially from an author's perspective, if someone emails you about your book and they're like, I really liked your book, but I really wish it had a chapter on this or an infographic in your case on that, and you reply saying, great idea, I did it, and I added it to my book.
Oh, that's huge.
They love it for all kinds of genuine reasons. And they'll tell people about it, and they'll spread the word about your book, and that's how you grow your audience and stuff like that. So starting from the genuine one-on-one interaction,
right,
I think is probably the best way to start. Obviously, we'd all love to have 10 million YouTube followers and stuff like that. That's the goal in a certain sense. But you've got to start. I would venture to say starting out with the one-on-one is probably the best thing to do.
Okay. So, it's funny. I was thinking about what you were saying, or I was, kind of chewing at it as it came out. And I was thinking, what are examples of successful communities? And one thing that kind of jumped in my mind was Reddit, which is really just, it's nothing but communities. Okay. And usually there are a couple of moderators. And so you kind of get the discussion going. So I'm kind of thinking that, maybe starting a Reddit, or, and maybe a collaboration between Reddit and Leanpub might be an interesting thing. I don't know. Or, or interfaces or something like that. I hear you, and I agree with you about the importance of one-on-one collaboration. And I've got an article somewhere on my blog way back when about my BMW from Zipcar, where I actually kind of shamed them into putting a BMW because I wanted to drive a BMW into a park that the nearest BMW was way far away. And so I tweeted about it in public, and they said, "Oh, well, we'll do it right away." And then I was like, "Oh my God, now I have to use it."
Right.
But I've also had examples with my clients who did exactly that. They would go visit their customers, and they would actually use some of the uncertainty in the sprint planning to, if you have any slack, here are a couple of customer requests, let's put them in. And this guy, once a quarter, he would go visit his main customers and say, "Look at here's your feature. How do you like it?" And they loved it. So this idea of somehow you influence the product and it's visible that people really like that. When I did the 10 contracts book, and by the way, my next project for Leanpub, I think, is going to be to do a second edition of the 10 contracts book.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because it's been about 4 years now, and there have been some interesting updates. Between the the Agile Contract Manifesto and what's kind of filtering through from Tesla and SpaceX, how they work with contractors, which is also kind of rethinking everything. So I think it's time to do a second edition. But I got a lot of feedback. Some of it came on LinkedIn, some of it came through email. The problem I had was keeping track of all of it, because you get this flood of emails and stuff, and it's I don't know. I found that the challenge wasn't so much getting the feedback as maybe organizing the feedback. And so maybe an interesting middle ground would be like an author's email. So like I get an email address at Leanpub, or maybe my book gets, and I could then send emails to buyers, and kind of I can channel the correspondence through that email, and then you guys could, and then kind of all the email stays in one place. So just thinking aloud.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting idea. That's sort of, I'll think about that. That's really good, and I'll share that with the team. That's a really good idea. Well, Peter, thank you very much for taking some time out of a morning when I guess you might have otherwise been creating a new infographic to talk to me, to talk to us about your really great book. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as one of the platforms for distributing it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been great, and I'm really excited about this, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with you in the future. So this is going to be great. Thank you so much for having me.